And I think it's mainly the republics and the governments in those republics. And for those governments to survive and exist, they're going to have a great amount of credibility and recognition from the West, and they're not going to get that by selling nuclear weapons to Iraq. True. They need the help, the advice, the aid of the West, and they're not going to get that if they go selling nuclear weapons.
I think it's all the conversation or discussion so far is leading to one of the things that the West has not yet recognised, that the Gorbachev central government is now defunct, and that it is time that the West recognised the independent claims of all the republics in Ukraine. And with the nuclear weapons, Ukraine will, and the Commonwealth republics, are not able to cede their weapons yet. They need guarantees from the Western world. They'll give up their nuclear weapons under the correct international auspices. They're not out to widen their borders. They want to protect their people. They need international recognition from the West that they are independent countries. Yes. And we demand, in fact, that the West finally recognises the Ukrainians, all the republics. I'm Ukrainian by origin in this country. But I think to avert social unrest, which everyone's fearful of in the West, to avert the fears of nuclear war, then the West should recognise the governments.
You make it sound so kind of easy and wonderful and straightforward. And all the evidence before our very eyes this very morning is to the contrary. The evidence that we've got of all the ethnic conflicts that are actually taking place within the Soviet Union at this very moment, whether it be in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, wherever, Tankent, whether it's the problems that we're seeing in Yugoslavia, throughout Yugoslavia, and the ethnic violence there, they're not actually, are they sitting down and negotiating calmly, reasonably? They're fighting each other.
The West hasn't given any kind of forum for these people to discuss.
You make it sound as if it's the West's problem?
I think it partly is the West's problem. These governments have declared democracy. The West, I think, is morally obliged to help these people, both in the short term with economic aid through the winter and in the long term to help stabilise those countries.
You don't think there's a problem of a rise of nationalism there, just as you saw, for example, in Romania? I mean, that wasn't a peaceful transfer to power. It still isn't, is it?
Well, the Soviet putsch, I think, was a very peaceful transfer to power. I think the West has hindered the process by not dealing with the republics directly, by maintaining the false illusion that Gorbachev still has some position to maintain.
Personally, I think it's an imperative that we retain an acquaintance and a working acquaintance with Gorbachev, for after all, if we're to subsist in a conducive society...
No.
If we're to
talk to him.
In a conducive society, I think peace is as integral a process as any transition.
But Gorbachev has no position left. It has been shown. He began the process of perestroika, maybe in glasnost, and unleashed the desires of all the 300 million people in the Soviet Republic to build up independence, to get freedom of speech. But Gorbachev didn't recognise either the nationalities, either individual human rights. He was maintaining the Moscow centre to a corrupt and powerful system of 70 years of communism.
An international order, surely peace is as integral a part of that process as any transition from a totalitarian state to a free market economy.
You're arguing that we maintain a system of colonial government which was established in 1922, has destroyed wealthy countries. Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan has such wealth. 70 years of communist government has destroyed the wealth of those lands.
Is it now that destruction of 70 years of communist rule, is that going to cause a rise in ethnic conflict between the various nationalities, vying for power, vying for land, just as we see happening between Croatia and Serbia?
Yes, I think so, but I'd like to come back to a very important point, I think.
Everybody wants to come back. As you're moving forward, we're going back. I need to go forward. We can't go back. John, do you believe that nationalism is going to rise?
I think there must be a very real risk of this. If you look at what has happened in the Central European states, they've become very nationalistic. If you look at what has happened historically in the Soviet Union, there's been nationalism, there's been racism, there's been pamyat. I believe all of that will happen simply because the economy is so depressed that they're going to have so many difficulties that they will seek to blame someone else for what is going on. And those are the very grounds on which nationalism builds up. And I think you will find that those Russians who were sent out to colonize other states of the Soviet Union will themselves be the victims of nationalism.
John, of course, it's a big dangerous nationalism tendencies, but it's not only Soviet tendency or Russian, it's world tendency. And what's more dangerous at the moment, for example, it seems to me that Mr. Yeltsin and even other presidents in other republics, they have not enough unit from the, within them's government. That's very important questions. And they have not enough enough profession politicians. And more, they could destroy old system. They have a good power to destruction, but they have not any serious knowledge about constructive, creating new values. And that's important point from the West, help from the West to Soviet Union, maybe more important than food aid.
Right.
Well,
What happens?
Hang on, Anthony, sorry.
What happens in a fragmented Soviet Union with 15 republics?
Yeah,
now
you can
going their
answer
separate
this,
ways?
Anthony. Anthony, can you turn round?
Yeah, with 15 republics going their separate way. Now, you've got a population, I think, in Russia of something like 265 million people, of which...
Soviet Union.
The old Soviet Union. Of which I think somewhere about 1/5, about 45 million, follow the Muslim religion. Now, what happens if you get somebody with the ilk of Saddam Hussein comes to power and, because of the vastness of the area of Russia, decides to start throwing these horrendous nuclear arsenal about? I mean, so they can threaten, and due to the vastness of the area, they might be tempted to use it. We've seen what happened in Yugoslavia. The United Nations, although Yugoslavia is an integral part of Europe, close to us, they've not been able to contain it. They've violated 14 ceasefires, and as far as I can see, in that sphere, the United Nations power, to me, seems little more than the growl of a toothless tiger in that aspect.
Well, the Soviet Union of 100 different nationalities. You have a basic division between the Slav Orthodox Christian side and then the 5 Muslim republics. Clearly, this is a fairly unstable basis. Yes. We are talking about the dissolution of an empire, but the kind of model that they are working towards, and which is now possible on the rubble of the empire, is to try and form a kind of a much looser political framework of sovereign states prepared to give up some of their sovereignty at the center. They're still debating as to how much should be given up and how much power should be at the center. And clearly the nation states are going to be the major actors in the future, which we are going to have to deal with. But if you look at the European community, that too is an association of sovereign national states. And I think that that is the sort of model that some of the more enlightened people, at least in this part of the world, are looking for. And I think that here in England, to talk about nationalism as a great danger, well, certainly it is. And we've seen in the past with Nazism and fascism and communism itself. But after Maastricht, we were all in there negotiating for our national interests, and perhaps as a basis for political cooperation, nationalism is not such a bad basis to start. Certainly the old empire was not a good one, the Soviet Empire.
Well, part of the problem, of course, is that all the control structures have now broken down, and perhaps most importantly of all, that of law and order. So we're really dealing with a situation of anarchy. And the thing that really concerns me is the only thriving industry, if you like, in the Soviet Union seems to be crime.
You worried that we're going to get the rise of fascism?
Well, yes, because
which we've had even in places like Romania, where it hasn't been an orderly progress towards democratic and constitutional rule, has it?
Well, you see, what people are looking for is some form of focus, because at the moment they have absolutely no security whatsoever. They don't even know where the next bite is going to come from. They don't know how they're going to be governed next month, and all the time things are changing.
Yeah,
you don't have to move.
Basically, I'm here because I'm sick and tired of people knocking Mikhail Gorbachev. People don't seem to realize what he has done since he came into power. No other Russian leader would have done it, and when the West had a chance to give him the aid to get his plan off the ground, they didn't do it. The only reason that they didn't do it is because they couldn't figure out a way to get the money through some scheme from the British public, who give the aid to every other country they want to give it. And just going back on one little point previously about the food supply...
Should we be giving more aid then, John? Hold on.
No,
John,
I think the reason we didn't give aid to Gorbachev very simply was this, that the problems of the Soviet Union are a function of their economic system. If you're not going to change the economic system, giving aid is just throwing money away.
But he was prepared. He had a strategy to change the system, but you didn't think that this strategy suited you. So what you did was you arranged it. the British government, I'm sure, and the Western governments arranged it so that Mr. Yeltsin got pushed up with his plan, which was a much more revolutionary plan, which is now putting us in this state of confusion that it's in. Now you're worried about the nuclear weapons. It's your own faults.
This is absolute rubbish. The Soviet economy was sheer chaotic. Sheerly, the technology was completely out of date. The food distribution was so chaotic that a quarter of the food produced in the Soviet Union was never even consumed.
This
has been true for years.
That's because the one thing that hasn't been stamped on in the Soviet Union is the black market. If you've got enough dollars in your pocket, you can get all the food you like. You'll never be hungry if you've got the dollars in your pocket.
What you're saying is it's a corrupt economy, which is a further reason why it shouldn't be given economic assistance. The real problem is that communism doesn't encourage people to work harder. It doesn't encourage them to produce the right goods at the right price of the right quality. It was a failure of the Soviet economy. It was a failure of the communist system. Why is it that McDonald's had to import potatoes when they opened their first hamburger bar in the Soviet Union?
But anybody who imagines that Mikhail Gorbachev intended to produce the situation that's happened is dreaming. I mean, it's a complete myth. Mikhail Gorbachev is a dyed-in-the-wool communist. That's what he says he is. That's what he wanted. All he wanted to do was to make communism work. Communism, if you walk around any of the streets in the Soviet Union, communism doesn't work. It hasn't worked. In the 60s, in the 70s, all the Russian people said, oh, well, we're living in this communist society. We know ultimately it's going to be much better than the West, and that's why we'll put up with shortage today.
So should we be giving
and
aid?
now it's collapsed.
So should we be giving aid
we've
now?
got to, well, yes, realpolitik says we should be following our own interests, and that's what we'll do anyway, and give sufficient aid to get them through this, to get a situation that we want, and ultimately they will want in the end.
I think we should give them aid. Will be beneficial for us in long term in the West. I have a picture here, and yesterday mail on Sunday, just outside Moscow.
Sorry to do that to you.
Just outside Moscow.
This is on the mail on Sunday. People rummaging in rubbish. Oh, she's got a mail, and I saw that picture.
Yes. Now, that means that they are able to produce for themselves. Why people cannot buy in the shops? That is a question we should ask. They produce enough things for them to eat, exactly like in Romania.
But should we be giving aid? Should we be giving aid?
Part of the problem is that here we have a third world country that's been masquerading as a first world power. I think this is fundamentally the problem. We've all felt that we were under threat. And yes, that's right. But I mean, that's not the people's fault. This was the fault of the regime that they had to live under.
There's a limited number of things you can give money to, aren't you? And a limitless number of demands. Do we give to the Ethiopians or do we give to the Russians?
This is a dilemma. Of course it's a dilemma. But I think we actually have a vested interest in
But it's a dilemma that has to be addressed.
That's right.
Somebody's got to answer the question. Somebody has to say yes.
The harsh reality is this: we have a vested interest in the West in making sure that those states are as secure and stable as possible.
It's more important for us to give aid to Russia because it provides a stable. But somebody has to. But listen, I know because I've been involved in some of these. Those are the kind of hard decisions you have to make. Somebody has actually got to make that decision of using your money and mine and saying, now there it is. Do we give it to, let us say, the Ethiopians and stop them dying of starvation, or do we give it to the Russians? You're saying, well, in the end, our survival depends upon keeping the Eastern Europeans stable.
For all the reasons we've just been talking about, but please don't forget that in this land mass, we have the greatest mineral wealth in the whole world. The's more oil in Siberia than there is in the whole of the Middle East.
Virtually, in terms of resources.
And the irony is they've got nothing. So we have a vested interest.
I'm Russian, and living in Russia 1 year ago, if you would ask me if we need help from the West, I would say no, thank you. Because the majority of Russians would be ashamed to take help, having such a history, having such resources. But now, living apart from Russia and thinking about it, I would say, please help. But talking about help, we are not talking about money. You can help by sending advisors, sending consultants who know how to change it, how to change communist system. Because we knew for a long time that Western countries were not happy about communism regime. But now, now communism regime collapsed. So it isn't fair just to close your border now and say it's your problem. Sorry, we just close.
No, it's our problem, is it?
Yes.
It's our problem. It isn't. Hang on.
Yes.
I see. Now it's our problem. A year ago you said no, you don't want to know, but now because it's our problem. It's the West problem.
Yes.
Why?
I think so, because such huge country with such weapons just couldn't will influence the whole world.
Any aid could help change the political situation.
Yes, Sarah, go on.
You say that all the only help we need to give is know-how, which I agree with, but if people are starving this winter, how can you not give food? And also, how is the help going to be? How many years do we have to give food aid? And is just food aid enough? And we seem to think that just because people have democratically elected governments that then everything's going to be okay, but that's just the beginning, surely.
A group of children in Scotland sent £4,000 worth of food aid out last January. I had to phone Moscow 6 times to get that food out of the airport. They kept sending a lorry from Yaroslavl up to collect this food, and I sent them a telegram to say it was on the plane. No, it's not on the plane, so they just turned tail and went back to Yaroslavl instead of saying, well, where is the food? Nobody bothered to get the food out for them.
Do you want to send this into this black hole? She's talking about a black hole there.
Well, but that's exactly...
Basically.
I mean, the point she just made. School children sent the aid to the Soviet Union. Do you see what I mean? It's always the public
But did you hear what happened to it?
Yeah, but it
just disappeared.
No, it didn't disappear.
Well, it didn't disappear. No, it didn't get there.
Eventually, after I phoned 6 times, and I've got no Russian, I had to phone different people to try and help me. But the Russian people themselves must help themselves and find out what's happened to things that have been sent out.
The KGB and the Red Army officers never went without a meal in their lives. They're all very well-fed-looking people. They're still spending billions every day on weapons. Let's make our aid conditional. They stop making weapons, they give up this massive supply of weapons, then we'll give food to those that they repressed. First we'll start in the republics. First we'll give the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Afghans, and the Kazakhs, and all these people the Georgians who've been repressed for so long. Give them the aid first. Let the KGB and the Red Army go and look for their food like the people of the Soviet Union have had to do since.
Do you know children are starving over there?
Yes, I do.
Yes, we know children, and we saw them in March, and then we brought them over here for a holiday for a fortnight and fed them up well. You could see every bone in these children's body. It's not the children's fault. They can't help it.
You need a structure to, as exactly your point has been proved, you need a structure that can distribute this food to people. They haven't got that structure because they're so corrupt.
But I saw... Is there an element where, perhaps, John, we should be trading the aid? I mean, is that an element that would be attractive to you? Yes, we'll give aid, we'll give economic assistance, or we'll send advisors, whatever form it takes, in exchange for the dismantling or of nuclear weapons.
Certainly, any assistance...
I mean, that's what Her's talking about this morning, isn't it?
Any assistance that is given has to be conditional upon the Soviet Union adopting the right sort of economic structure so that these problems won't reappear. It has to be conditional upon human rights being maintained. It also...
Can I...
Well,
hang on. Blackmail aid.
Well,
that's what you're saying.
Why should we give aid to people who deny others human rights?
One at a time. What about you are talking? You are talking about your West problems. You don't talking about Russian or Soviet problems. You are talking about your attitude to problem of aid. You don't talking about what's going on in Russia, what could happen.
I think if you look up aid in a dictionary, it will say that it's assistance, charity that you give somebody. You don't.
But you don't have to do what a dictionary says, though, do you?
No, but
this is the real world we're living in.
You don't go to somebody and say, "Oh, here, I'm giving you aid."
Yeah, you do.
But next week you're going to have to do this for me.
Yeah, you do. Why isn't it? Of course you do.
This
why not? Hang on. Why not? Why not?
There should be.
There's no logic to what you're saying. Listen, they want things that we've got. We're saying, okay, we'll do a deal. We'll make a bargain. Don't we always do bargains and deals? What's wrong with the bargain saying dismantle your nuclear weapons? You can have all the aid you want.
I'm not against that, but
it's not blackmail then.
This gentleman.
It's not blackmail. Hang on. It's not blackmail then.
No, sorry, you can't tell me that by giving aid to somebody on.
Are you in favour of nuclear weapons?
No, of course I'm not.
Well,
absolutely not.
Are you a member of C&D?
No, I'm not. No.
A supporter of?
No.
Oh, what a shame! I thought you might have been. You can see what I'm getting at. Okay,
yes,
but isn't you're killing two things with one stone, aren't you? Here, two birds with one stone.
Okay, look, can I just go back there 1 second to that man said, okay, we'll give aid, but first of all, we'll give aid to the republics that have now going into the Commonwealth and not give aid to the other
Don't
ones.
get off yourself, I'm not going away.
Not give aid to the other countries that aren't going into the Commonwealth. Well, there's your recipe for confrontation and the use of the nuclear weapons that the other states are going to have. I'm sure if you're going to give food to one man and not give it to another man because his country hasn't joined the Commonwealth, there's going to be some kind of
conditions. They give up their weapons.
Pavel, is it, Ralph, isn't that... I mean, what's wrong with that? That sounds like a good bargain to me.
Let me just talk a little less controversially. I believe...
But I want, on this particular issue, because this is what the British Foreign Secretary is saying this very morning, OK, and James Baker is starting to suggest, yes, we will help the Soviet Union or the new Commonwealth of former Soviet republics, but they've got to do something in return. And one of the things they can do in return is give up, or give us, or allow us to dismantle, destroy their nuclear weapon. What is wrong with that?
Nothing at all. I think the important point to recognise is that the Commonwealth will fail, and any new structure will fail, unless some standby credit or some aid is given. Now, that could be conditional, but we mustn't make it so conditional that we never actually give the aid.
If they want the aid that much, if you're saying they need it that bad, then we could strike an even better deal, can't we? Sure. We could get rid of all their weapons. What's wrong? I don't understand why we shouldn't be striking this deal.
Well, the crucial thing, as I see it, is this winter. They've got to get through this winter.
Absolutely.
If we don't get the food out to them, you can have all kinds of uprisings starting so soon.
There's something everyone doesn't quite understand. There is long-term aid where you can bargain, and there is short-term. The situation is so grim, so desperate, you can't bargain now. There should be something like a Berlin airlift organized with IRF, US Air Force.
It might not be very nice, but you can bargain now. The more desperate it is, I'm not suggesting it's nice or very pleasant or even honourable.
People are already fainting of hunger in the streets. Do you know that in Volgograd, in former Stalingrad?
We've got a food mountain. Why don't we get the food mountain down?
I don't think we should argue about humanitarian.
Trump has already saved the US government $50 billion this year in its military budget because he ended the Cold War. They've already given something in return. What are we going to do about it?
I say it's not enough.
It isn't enough.
No, I'm using your argument and I'm turning it back on you. I'm the British government or the American government. I turn around and say, fine, yeah, I like perestroika, glasnost, but you know, now we're in a position we can do more. We can produce a safer world. George Bush's New World Order. Wonderful opportunity. Sure. Not just to get rid of nuclear weapons from the former Soviet Union, but as some of us have said, that might conceivably fall into the hands of kind of new fascist dictators within the former Soviet Empire or be sold throughout the rest of the world. What a wonderful opportunity to get rid of all that.
Absolutely, and we should do all that.
Food for guns sounds like a good deal to me.
But we have to invest in security. Yes, we need to dismantle, we need to demilitarize, we need to deconstruct. But in order to do that, we have to prevent the kind of outbreak of anarchy, which is actually going to lead to exactly the insecurity that we're involved in.
It depends about what aid we are talking about. If we are talking about humanitarian aid just to help people dying in the street, you will help people dying in the street here. So then there should be no conditions. But if you're thinking...
no conditions.
No conditions. No conditions. In this case, people are dying. You are human. Well, we are all human, and we help people dying in the street.
Well, why don't we give it to the Ethiopians then? Why do the Russians have priority?
Oh, the Russians help Ethiopians as well as English. You know about that. I'm from Ukraine, and I know we helped.
All right, why do the Ukrainians have priority over the Ethiopians or those?
No, I'm not talking about priority.
In the end, that's what it comes down to.
I'm talking about bread, giving people bread.
There isn't an unlimited amount of aid that people are prepared to give.
Well, I'm not talking about unlimited amount. I'm just talking about giving people bread and not giving money. If you put money into economy, for example, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, or whatever, then certainly you can put conditions. But if you are giving humanitarian aid, just milk to children, then...
When I was in Latvia during the summer, and I was walking down the streets, and I saw soap powder being unloaded from an ambulance into a hard currency store. That is Western soap powder. That is aid going. If it wasn't there without any conditions, you know, it has to be checked on and make sure it goes to the right people.
Absolutely. What are the conditions? John, you spoke earlier, conditions too, not just of getting rid of nuclear weapons or other armaments, but you're saying we should impose conditions about movement towards democratic rule, human rights, like our friend over there was talking about?
Yes, because one of the great risks in the Soviet Union today is that there will be an outburst of nationalism that's going to lead to discrimination against minorities. We have to make it quite certain that that doesn't happen.
I
find that your fault. I'm really sick.
You've gobsmacked him, look at him.
Oh, yes, look, I am sick. I know a lot of you don't like Gorbachev. I do, all right? We got used to him. Better the devil you know than the one you don't, and you've got rid of him. And I don't...
No, that's not quite true.
Well, I can't stand there either.
Ah, but she was the devil you knew. She belonged there.
No, but
so it's not better the devil you know then?
No, you know...
Depends whether you like him, you mean?
Yeah. You see, Major was stood outside, poor Gorbachev, going there with cap in hand, begging you lot. And also America. Oh, don't be so cynical. He was trying to change things. I still think...
But don't you think we should impose conditions?
No, I don't.
Why?
I saw a lot of old ladies there queuing and crying, and they wanted food, and you give it. And you don't stand outside number 10, and you don't stand outside the place. Oh, just shut it a minute. You've talked enough. Never shut up, you.
Sound like my mum, you do.
Well, the White House, he was stood outside there and they shake hands with him, Gorbachev, make him feel, and then they send him home with his tail between his legs. You could have done it long ago.
John, let him come back to you. Go on, John.
What you have to recognise is the system was incompetent and corrupt, and if we'd given unconditional aid, it would not have gone to the people who needed it.
You don't want
it. Was somebody else far too slowly.
Quick.
I think all this business of Gorbachev, the man has served his purpose, basically. He doesn't really represent the Russian people anymore.
Do you think the new Commonwealth is actually going to work?
I think it will work, but it will only work now that Gorbachev's failure was he didn't get rid of the Communist Party. He didn't recognize that it was finished. Yeltsin has recognized that, and what you have to set up is a structure where you don't have corruption. I have Russian friends in Mogilev, in Byelorussia, and I've kept in touch with them. They've been over here twice this in the last year, and there is no doubt that the hardline elements in the Soviet Union, aid and food aid, particularly last winter, was being salted away to create artificial shortages.
Okay, quick, will the new Commonwealth work, Mary?
I think it's got a better chance than anything else we've seen up to date. The old system didn't. The reforms still under Gorbachev holding central control couldn't. Now we've got a chance.
And I have to finish there on time. See you in the morning. Sorry about that.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin has announced that he's taking over the Kremlin, the centre of Soviet power for more than 70 years. He's ordered Mr. Gorbachev's staff out and his own people in. Russians are also taking over the interior and foreign ministries. Mr. Gorbachev's foreign minister, Mr. Edvard Shevardnadze, has been pushed out.
The Soviet foreign ministry was tonight a forlorn monument to a fallen empire. Its bureaucrats spilled out into the street, their future uncertain under the new rule of Boris Yeltsin's Russia. Some predicted more than 1 in 10 would be sacked. Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze went home clearly saddened. Why should I resign when I haven't got the ministry anymore? He asked ITN. And he left no doubt that Mikhail Gorbachev would soon follow.
I think yes. He'll leave, and I'll leave with him. It's good that it ends up that way. We started together, and we'll finish together.
And Vitaly Churkin, Mr. Shevardnadze's spokesman and a ministry staffer for 17 years, was reflecting on the end of an era.
This is only part of a sadness which many people feel who have gotten used to living in a country which was called the Soviet Union.
And Mikhail Gorbachev declared on state television tonight, the era of the USSR is over. A country formed over centuries was breaking up. It won't be easy, he warned. Mr. Gorbachev's humiliation was complete today. As he settled down for talks with German aid officials, he was being unceremoniously stripped of the last vestiges of power. Boris Yeltsin finally turned his back on his old rival. He set off for a visit to Rome, leaving behind decrees giving his Russian Republic control of the central government, its buildings, its staff and its assets. The final stroke of a constitutional coup. For all practical purposes, Gorbachev has no future role, he said. The Kremlin, seat of Soviet power for more than 70 years, is now Russian, along with the scores of ministries it used to control. The mayor of Moscow, Gavril Popov, was one of Mr. Yeltsin's closest allies. Now he's threatening to resign. Today, he said developments in Russia were mirroring the chaos of Germany's pre-war Weimar Republic. As Mr. Yeltsin assumes ever greater powers, he knows stability and his own future depend on swift economic improvement.
The question is whether his presidency will be an act of self-immolation. In other words, by pushing through the things which are necessary and are supported by the public, he will ultimately become the victim of the processes which he will have unleashed, which was the fate that befell Gorbachev.
4 years ago, Mikhail Gorbachev sacked Boris Yeltsin from the old communist Politburo. He may view that as one of his greatest mistakes. Tonight, Mr. Yeltsin's revenge is complete. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
American Secretary of State James Baker said today the collapse of the Soviet Union could lead to further reductions in nuclear weapons. He was speaking after a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels. Mr. Baker said he expected the Russian Federation to be the only Soviet republic to keep nuclear weapons. The NATO ministers also agreed to use their troops to transport food and medicine to the Soviet Union. NATO has until now never operated in the humanitarian role.
The problems they face are very large. They are asking for our help. They need our help, and we should give it.
A police sergeant has been shot and seriously injured in West London.
As the old order passes, no one knows what's replacing it. Boris Yeltsin says he's taken over the building, but he was glad handing it in Italy today, 1,500 miles from the confusion. Back in the Kremlin, the main players of the old order didn't know what was going on. President Gorbachev was carrying on regardless. One official Soviet spokesman said Yeltsin's conduct was insulting to the president and to his foreign minister, who yesterday by decree became ex-foreign minister. Edward Shevardnadze himself first heard that he was out of a job from TASS. His aide warned the consequences of closing the foreign ministry could be quite disastrous. But a foreign ministry spokesman told Newsnight today that no one had yet officially confirmed this had happened. This is all creating some bizarre problems for the West. It was certainly simpler when NATO confronted the Warsaw Pact, and that was that. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Eastern Bloc mean that instead of threatening invasion, the Eastern nations are now angling for invitations to join the club in their search for an umbrella of security and even protection from their own neighbours. Today was the first session of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, which brings together the old Cold War enemies. The latest diktat from Moscow was that NATO mustn't use the title Soviet Union anymore.
In accordance with the latest instructions received from Moscow, which result from the consultations between the sovereign states, we request that all references to the Soviet Union be excluded from the text of the statement.
Equally breathtaking was a message from Mr. Yeltsin asking officially that Russia be considered as a future member of NATO. Similar approaches came from Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. But NATO leaders indicated their chances of being admitted were, at least in the short term, exceedingly slim. What the newly independent states in the East want is a guarantee of security. What they were offered today was a friendly pat on the back. And this evening, Boris Yeltsin added to the confusion by begging reporters in Italy not to ask him about NATO. A Russian application for membership was, he said, only a hypothetical thesis. Well, earlier I asked NATO's Secretary-General Manfred Werner whether he agreed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was making Europe a much less secure place.
No, definitely not. It's more complicated. It's more differentiated. But the risk of a major confrontation has definitely gone away, and I think will not reappear. So what we are now doing is we're transforming our alliance to adapt a more political role and to be a kind of a reassurance against risks and to make our contribution to build a new all-European or Euro-Atlantic security architecture.
What is the problem then, Herr Werner, with simply inviting these countries who want to join up to come in? Czechoslovakia and indeed, perhaps in the long term, Russia as well.
Well, it's very simple. We want them to come closer to the alliance. We want them to be partners. We want them to exchange views, informations, to consult with us so that we can contribute to prevent crises or to resolve them if they appear.
Now, Jenny Dienstbier, who's the Foreign Secretary of Czechoslovakia, which is the most anxious to have a much closer alliance with NATO, has said that he would seek help from NATO if, in case we were endangered, we should then demand the full protection of the Western alliance. But that's quite a dangerous road for NATO to travel, is it not? That might involve Western troops intervening in a neighborly dispute somewhere in Eastern Europe.
First of all, our goal, our objective is to prevent such cases. And I think by cooperating with them, we make it much more unlikely that such a scenario would appear. That is part of the reason why we are doing what we are doing. And secondly, if such a situation would arise, we would consult with them, and then we would have to decide if and what kind of action to take.
But in those circumstances, what would NATO actually do?
Why should I speculate now on what we would do? First of all, that would depend on the situation, and then it would depend on the attitude of our member nations. But everybody who wants or who would be tempted to consider such a situation should know that it would create a very serious situation with very serious consequences. That's all what I have to say, and I will not speculate about scenarios. We want to prevent them.
Well, leaders of the 11 Soviet republics have begun arriving in Kazakhstan to hammer out a deal to expand and formalize the Commonwealth of Independent States set up 12 days ago by Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, is believed to be waiting only for the legal handover from the old Union to the Commonwealth before he resigns. In the last 6 years, the impact of the Gorbachev revolution has been felt all over the world. Now it has ended his own political career. Julian O'Halloran assesses Gorbachev's remarkable achievements and the cause of his ultimate defeat.
Mikhail Gorbachev was brought up in the most socialist of environments, a collective farm. As a local party boss and as agriculture minister, he gained real insight into the disastrous failure of the Soviet economy. He had the dynamism and courage to try and reform it, and to bring human rights and democracy to his people. He has transformed their relationship with the rest of the world, but he has obstinately refused to face up to the logical outcome of these changes at home. Emotionally and philosophically, he's remained a prisoner of the Soviet collective in which he grew up. The funeral of Leonid Brezhnev in 1982 did not end the stagnation which marked his rule. For 3 more years, the Soviet Union was to be run by the same exhausted men and ideas. But in the next generation, Mikhail Gorbachev was using luck, energy, and tactical brilliance to position himself for the leadership. He got his chance and seized it in 1985. Within months of taking over, Gorbachev went out in the streets of Leningrad seeking popular support for the dramatic changes he was planning.
А что думают ленинградцы о нашей политике? Как мы шаги в правильном направлении делаем или нет? Я? А вот для этого всего, все это нужно.
Держитесь ближе к народу, мы никогда вас не подведем.
Ну куда ж ближе?
But despite many more walkabouts, Gorbachev was neither a populist nor a good listener. And to his cost, he resisted the message he heard from Armenia to the Baltics. In dealing with the outside world, Gorbachev had undiluted success, unless you were a Cold Warrior or a Stalinist. From the early summits like Reykjavik, Gorbachev used agility and surprise to agree massive arms reductions with the West. He made President Reagan look amateurish and deftly opened up splits in NATO. But on disarmament, time after time, he delivered. Of course, on his side, deep defense cuts were necessitated by the ballooning Soviet budget deficit. But at the UN, Gorbachev showed his real desire for peace by signaling the end of the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe.
The Soviet Union has taken a decision to reduce its armed forces. Within the next 2 years, their numerical strength will be reduced by 500,000 men.
Within 12 months of that speech, the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe were going down like ninepins, with little violence except in Romania. When Gorbachev collected his Nobel Peace Prize last year, his status as a man who changed the course of history was unchallenged. But at home, he was in deep trouble and his power was slipping away. Of Gorbachev's mistakes, democratizing the system and expecting the party to survive intact was perhaps the most basic. In 1988, he sprang a surprise on the party congress, a rapid timetable for a freely elected parliament.
Михаил Александрович, раз мы говорим, что все, что происходило в прошлом, и главный урок состоит в том, что народ был выключен из процесса общественной жизни и процесса выработки и принятия решений, то сегодня через политическую демократию, а мы о ней...
The stunned communist deputies agreed, almost unaware, they were voting themselves out of existence. Real democracy gave the popular sacked Politburo member Boris Yeltsin the ladder he needed to climb back to power. Elected as a deputy in 1989, he then won a place on the Supreme Soviet and was finally elected president of the Russian Federation. Whilst democracy bore him ever upward, it set the seal on the unpopular Gorbachev's decline. Gorbachev's half-baked reforms of Lenin's economic legacy were seen as only prolonging the agony. In the room where Lenin launched the revolution, Gorbachev had, soon after coming to power, told the people of Leningrad with brutal clarity that they were producing rubbish.
Техника не та, и производительность на нее не возьмешь, и качество, и строчки все эти отделки не возьмешь. Ну разве так можно вести в Ленинграде легкую промышленность? Вот тут надо шевелить мозгами, это точно. Математическая тут наша приставка слаба, основательно, товарищ. Очень слаба.
It was one thing to tear the old system apart, another to restructure it. A dozen plans were mooted to bring in the free market, but none was implemented. Some say Gorbachev doesn't understand the market. He's resisted shock therapy, believing greater efficiency could make a watered-down socialism work. The refusal of Western leaders at this year's G7 summit to bail out the sinking Soviet Union was the final proof that capitalism judged economic perestroika to have utterly failed. The 15 republics of the Soviet Union were held together not by collective interest, but by coercion. Although Gorbachev eventually proposed a union of sovereign states, he saw the USSR essentially as an entity. Even in the Baltic republics, victims of Hitler and Stalin's carve-up, Gorbachev bullied the nationalists, knowing that to give in to them could be the beginning of the end.
Я сам лично. Лично сам. Вы ведь написали не больше права полное. Это значит что? Вы из Советского Союза собрались выходить? Ну так это когда ранее или поздно.
But the use of force against Lithuania last January and the loss of life only further weakened the Union. The August coup was an attempt by some of Gorbachev's own men to turn back the clock and save the old Soviet Union. Their failure simply speeded its breakup and Gorbachev's demise. Up to the last, he has tried to salvage something out of nothing, fearing not just the loss of his own job, but the rise of extreme nationalism. His fears may be justified, but his attempts to stop the process have long been doomed.
Well, I'm joined now from Glasgow by Professor Alec Nove, who's a Soviet expert at the University of Glasgow and has himself just returned from what we must now call the ex-Soviet Union. First of all, Professor Nove, is Mr. Gorbachev finished? Is his public career over, or does he have any residual role in the new Commonwealth, do you think?
I don't think he has, and I think his role is finished and has been finished for some time. He's already been president of nothing for a number of months.
OK, but we've seen Mr. Yeltsin fated in Rome in much the same way as Mr. Gorbachev was fated in the Western world 5 years ago. Given Mr. Yeltsin's huge problems, especially the economic problems, is he likely to prove any more durable than Mr. Gorbachev?
Not unless he manages to secure a much more effective power base, even in his own republic, than he has at the moment. May I quote his own Minister of Justice, writing 10 days ago in the Soviet press? I quote, "The central administrative system cannot possibly function. It is the total paralysis of Russian state structures." Now, that's the Minister of Justice speaking. Not only that, his own deputy, Rutskoy, has called Gorbachev's principal economic advisor and his friends what I can only describe as, and I quote, juvenile smarty pants. Мальчики в розовых штанишках in Russian. That's the best translation I can do. And believe it or not, Yeltsin has not commented on the matter.
But the curious thing, Professor Nov, is that other people in what was the Soviet Union, particularly the Ukrainians, are very concerned, very suspicious about what they see as the extraordinary rapidity with which Mr. Yeltsin has grabbed the instruments of state control, the KGB, the foreign and interior intelligence services, and they rather suspect he's got all the instruments there of a police state.
Well, he may very well find that the only way to bring order into his own republic, which is in grave danger of falling apart, according to many of the press statements in Moscow itself, is to act in an authoritarian, not a totalitarian, but an authoritarian way. There may, in fact, be no alternative doing so. People are now speaking of parts of Russia declaring their own sovereignty. East Siberian government is spoken of, a South Russian republic, a Cossack republic, a Tatar republic. In order to impose the economic reform, or indeed any sort of authority, he needs power. Power is at the moment something that he lacks. He can issue decrees, he can expel Gorbachev, he can kick a man when he's down. But what about imposing authority in an exceedingly difficult situation when you face economic catastrophe?
Yeah, indeed, but power is usable, power is also abusable. How much can we trust Mr. Yeltsin's democratic credentials not to use his power unwisely, as some feel he may do?
I think this is perfectly possible, but among my Russian friends there is the fear that unless he uses his power to establish authority and acts toughly, he in turn will be replaced by somebody like Rutskoy, who is a major general and used to bomb Afghanistan when the war with Afghanistan was on, who believes that vigorous measures are necessary to restore Russian power. And of course, without authority and without order in Russia, with economic catastrophe, the future of the Commonwealth, of which Russia is so integral a part, is very much in question, not so much because of the excessive power of Moscow, but the lack of power in Moscow.
So the Commonwealth could fall apart not because one is mightier than the others, but because none of them is strong enough to hold the whole thing together.
I think that may very well be, and one of the dangers is that if the nationalists, or Yeltsin in alliance with a Russian nationalist take power, they may indeed threaten some of the other republics, and hence nervousness in the Ukraine, and a number of amendments suggested by the Ukrainians to the draft treaty, which of course may or may not work.
Very, very briefly, Alec Nov, you've spent a lifetime studying the Soviet Union. You've been there recently. How frightened or optimistic are you about what might happen next?
Well, frankly, I would love to be optimistic. The people have suffered enough in this century. I see very considerable grounds for gloom. The forecast can only be described as stormy. One hopes they'll be able to weather it.
Professor Nov from Glasgow, thank you very much indeed. We stay in Scotland because the Monkton Hall coal mine in Scotland ceased production 4 years ago because it was said to be unprofitable.
Boris Yeltsin said he should now be allowed to resign with dignity. A decision on who will control the Soviet nuclear arsenal was postponed until the end of the month.
It was a meeting of presidents, 12 in all, carving out a place for their countries in history. The driving force, President Yeltsin, flanked by his allies. The Soviet Union ceases to exist, they declared. Their historic treaty, proclaiming a new Commonwealth, marks the formal end of the state Lenin founded in 1922. 11 republics have joined, Slavs and Central Asians side by side. Only the Republic of Georgia has stayed away. But the Commonwealth's historic creation raises as many questions as it answers. At a press conference after the signing ceremony, Boris Yeltsin made one thing clear. Mikhail Gorbachev's post as president no longer exists. We'll provide for him in retirement, he said. His resignation is expected early next week. But the 11 leaders postponed until the end of the year the vital decision about who will control the nuclear arsenal. For the moment, the status quo remains. Boris Yeltsin today rejected the concept of Commonwealth citizenship and destroyed all the central apparatus. He also secured agreement for Russia to take over the Soviet seat at the UN. A day of vision and victory for Boris Yeltsin, ending the Soviet Union, but heralding an unclear Commonwealth with a very uncertain future. Penny Marshall, ITN, Moscow.
A teenage boy died in hospital today after gunmen...
Sports Review 91 magazine. The tension, the magic, the challenge, the disappointment, the camaraderie, the rivalry, the misses and the successes. Sports Review 91 magazine, your complete guide to the sporting year.
Show me the Scrooge promo.
Enjoy the magic of Christmas on BBC One as TV boss Bill Murray says, bah humbug!
The real popcorn on a tree and cranberries and everything. It's a crock, James. It's for kids.
You don't change your ways, you're gonna wind up doomed, just as I am.
Will Bill Murray be swept up in the magic of Christmas when he's Scrooged at 3:20 on Christmas Eve on One?
This is BBC One. Now we go over to the newsroom and join Chris Lowe. It's 5:05.
Boris Yeltsin said 11 former republics dissolved the office of Soviet president and agree that the Soviet Union no longer exists. All leaders of the new Commonwealth of Independent States, the former Soviet republics, have declared that the Soviet Union no longer exists. Mikhail Gorbachev's job as president has been abolished. Responsibility for the armed forces has been handed to the Soviet defense minister, Marshal Shaposhnikov, but the question of who controls nuclear weapons has been deferred. 8 former republics joined the original 3 at their meeting in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan to form the 11-state Commonwealth.
Boris Yeltsin flew into Alma-Ata today in buoyant mood. He had come to bury the Soviet Union and to build the new Commonwealth. Much to Mr. Yeltsin's pleasure, 11 republics turned up in all. Georgia was the odd one out, simply sending observers. The 11 took part in a signing ceremony that makes them all co-founders of the Commonwealth. This will not be a single state, but a collection of individual, independent countries, bound together by a network of political and economic agreements. They've decided to protect their external borders and to keep their internal ones open. With 11 signatures and a round of applause, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Afterwards, the leaders congratulated themselves, and then they held a joint news conference. Though this was a slightly shambolic start to the Commonwealth, the Ukrainian president couldn't even get his microphone to work. And it emerged that there'd also been a hitch on the question of who controls strategic nuclear weapons, currently held in the republics of these 4 men. A final agreement on exactly who's now in charge of the former Soviet Union's military might had to be put off until December the 30th, when there'll be another meeting in Minsk. In the meantime, the armed forces will be under the interim control of the Soviet defense minister, Yevgeny Shaposhnikov. As to the fate of President Gorbachev, who had not been invited here, Boris Yeltsin said he must resign with dignity. We respect Mikhail Sergeyevich, he said, but the leaders had already sent a message by telephone telling Mr. Gorbachev that the Soviet Union and his presidency were now no more. They thanked him for what they called his great and positive contribution. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
The African National Congress
founded the Commonwealth of Independent States to replace Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union. But they've left important economic and military questions unanswered and a constitutional mess in their wake. First, Mikhail Gorbachev is tonight still president, albeit of a country declared dead, and although his resignation is thought to be imminent, his central bureaucracy can't be dismantled overnight. This evening, amidst reports that President Gorbachev's staff were clearing out their desks from the Kremlin, there was mounting concern that Boris Yeltsin is steamrollering a Commonwealth without a detailed plan. His critics point to today's historic treaty. No long-term agreement on the vital issue of who's to control the nuclear arsenal. Boris Yeltsin appears set to have his finger on the nuclear button. The former Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Shaposhnikov remains temporarily Commander-in-Chief of Conventional Forces. A final decision on the fate of the 27,000 nuclear warheads, so anxiously awaited by the West, has been delayed until the end of the year. There will now be a period of transition. Each republic has yet to ratify the treaty in its own parliament. So far, it appears Boris Yeltsin has removed Mr. Gorbachev, checkmate, but he's also inherited most of his problems and some more of his own. Penny Marshall, ITN, Moscow.
After today's meeting between the American Secretary of State James Baker and the European Commission President Jacques Delors, both were ringing the alarm bells louder than ever about the danger of instability in the infant Commonwealth. They're calling for a worldwide effort to get food and medicine to its people this winter. Some has arrived, this from the EC came today, but widespread social unrest could jeopardize the delicate process of integrating the new republics in the community of nations. Britain today put its main worries about that process on the record. Of most immediate concern, the control of the old Soviet nuclear arsenal, and the question of whether the Commonwealth will honor arms control commitments made by Mr. Gorbachev. The West is also applying public pressure over human rights in the republics, and wants guarantees that they'll pay the debts the Soviet Union incurred. Western diplomats have begun to open the diplomatic channels with the new republics. Germany's Hans-Dietrich Genscher, quick off the mark, meeting the Ukrainian foreign minister today. But they are dealing with unknown quantities. Because apart from the Baltic states, none of the republics has any real experience of independence. Ukraine was fused with Russia in 1654. Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia enjoyed only 3 turbulent years of independence after the Soviet Revolution. And the Central Asian republics have always been controlled either by Moscow or by the ancient powers of Asia.
It's a step in the dark, and especially for the Muslim republics, if they come together in some kind of Muslim union, they will then create new conditions, and they will have to work out their own foreign policy aims and how they conduct those foreign policy aims.
It was all a great deal simpler for the West when President Gorbachev was in control. James Baker's meeting with him on Monday was not just a personal goodbye, it was a farewell to a diplomatic era when the West could do business with just one man.
2 people were killed and another 2 seriously wounded tonight.
He's already president of a country that effectively doesn't exist. In a recorded interview for American television, Mr. Gorbachev made it clear he wants no further delay.
The country needs movement, concord, coordination. We have wasted so much time. We must act. As soon as I receive official documents and see that the Commonwealth is a reality, within a few days, I will then take my decision. There won't be any easing up of controls over the nuclear weapons. This should not happen. I'm convinced of that. Our system is much stricter than the American. I always remind the Americans of that.
Boris Yeltsin flew back from the meeting which created the new Commonwealth of Independent States, declaring it's an historic event. There'll be no more center and no more dictatorship. But die-hard communists demonstrating in Moscow today accused Mr. Yeltsin of achieving what Hitler couldn't, the destruction of the Soviet Union. But yesterday's signing ceremony was only the beginning of what may prove a torturous process. The way ahead for the 11 now independent republics may not be easy.
There is a clear danger of disintegration, and one should keep in mind that a lot of documents signed there were very ambiguous and very loose. They can be interpreted in different ways.
Mounting turmoil in the Republic of Georgia, meanwhile, fighting between pro- and anti-government groups has left at least 4 dead. Georgia's not in the new Commonwealth, and as tensions mount, it shows every sign of disintegrating into its own civil war. Tim Ewart, ITN, Moscow.
A leading Protestant bishop in Ulster has begged...
Still delaying. As soon as he gets the official documents from Alma-Ata, he says, and sees that the new Commonwealth is a reality, he'll take his decision in a few days. As for the control of nuclear weapons under the Commonwealth, he said he was convinced there'd be no easing up. The system was stricter than the American one. The Alma-Ata agreement has had a violent aftermath in Georgia, which didn't sign with the other republics. Opposition groups have come out onto the streets in a violent protest against President Gamsa-Kurdia's refusal to join in with the others. At present, it seems to be almost civil war in the capital, Tbilisi. John Simpson, BBC News, Moscow. Another man was murdered last night in Northern Ireland, the fourth...
Power. Nightfall. And after 6 hours of talks, it emerged that Mr. Gorbachev was ready to hand over control of the nuclear arsenal to his one-time rival. Inside his private Kremlin office, few advisors left. Once the corridors of a superpower, now empty and silent, as Mr. Gorbachev and his staff prepare to leave. There's simply no work left for them to do. Alexander Likatel, Mr. Gorbachev's spokesman, probably used his hotline to the president for the last time tonight to hear of the British Prime Minister's phone call. He shares the president's concern about the Commonwealth.
All of us, we seems to be present at the birthday of the Commonwealth, so nobody knows what will be the child when it grows up.
Concern about the Commonwealth too from Alexander Rutskoy, Yeltsin's own vice president today. I'm alarmed about the undue haste with which it was signed, he said. But on the streets, no doubt about who's the top man. The traditional Gorby dolls have been outflanked and outsized by the Russian president. Back at the Kremlin tonight, no doubts now either. With Mr. Gorbachev certain to resign tomorrow or Wednesday, his staff could be parting for the last time. Penny Marshall, News at 10. Moscow.
In the southern, formerly Soviet Republic of Georgia, opponents of President Gamsa-Kurdia have again attacked the parliament and fought...
Mind you that our contestants have no idea what we have planned for them. It's just as well they should conserve their strength, because we have with us tonight the Mazepa Ukrainian Cossacks. The big fella is the manager. They're always the big fellas, the managers. Roman Kaleta, and you're all British-born.
That's right, second-generation Ukrainians.
No, it's marvellous. Now, have you ever appeared in the Ukraine?
No.
You never have?
No, but we're going to Ukraine.
Oh, you are, yes?
Yes, in June.
In June?
To do 2 benefit concerts.
Yes.
For the children of Chernobyl.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, well, good luck with that. Have a marvellous... Will you come back and do some more things, John? OK, there we go. Can we get them all in? OK. Now, we want the older people here next to... Oh, so the other side. Sorry, Rosemary, that's good. You stay here and you get in here. Right. Now, you see, they go in and do a bit and then you go in and do it up. OK? Look a swine in that hat. OK, are we ready? Cue music. Right. Now, what's it going? In you go, in you go. Right, good. Oh, no. fault. Could we have the stools, please? Yeah, this is for just you two. You're going to get no help at all, the younger people, but the older people, get on here, we'll start with that. By the way, this step is called the cobblers. You'll find out why in a minute, okay? So you ready? And really kick, 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 kick. Okay, cue music. Right, go on. Kick, kick. Okay, come back here. Right, hold them, hold them, hold them. Here you go, right, do it, do it. Come on, get up, get up. Out back, to the cobblers. Okay, come back. Watch it. Follow it, okay? Follow it, right, follow it. There you go. Yeah. All fall down, come on, cobblers. Everybody cobblers. Everybody cobblers. Everybody. Well, now, we need to change places. I wonder why, wouldn't it? So now then, how are we doing with these two?
Okay, Emma, that was fantastic. I give you 8.
Very good.
8 out of 10.
Excellent, yes. And how about Rotnat?
Well, John, your interpretation of the Nutcracker Suite was very, very good. I give you 7.
7 for John, Johnny. Okay, good. Now how about over here?
Brenda, tremendous. 8.
8, yes. And what about Freddie? That last bit was pretty good, wasn't it?
His cobblers were very good, yes?
Yes, certainly.
I give you 9.
9! Well done! All right. Roman, good luck with all you do and good luck with the Ukraine. I'm proud of you. Okay, fine. Come here, my darling. That's it. Well, what's on the board, Miss Ford?
Well, Emma and Johnny have scored 15, Glenda and Freddie have scored 17.
They're all 2 points in it. Okay, will you all go over there? All of you, and take that silly hat off. For goodness sake, take it off. Our next...
Territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is claimed by both Armenia and Azerbaijan, 11 people have died in an artillery attack by Azeri forces.
They want their own army. Along with Moldavia and Azerbaijan, they're refusing even to take part in a combined armed forces for the new Commonwealth. At this base, the hammer and sickle has long since gone. It's the Ukrainian national flag that flies here. These men, who used to be Soviet soldiers, now swear allegiance to the Ukraine alone. The Ukrainians say they're still committed to getting rid of nuclear weapons from their territory, but they don't want to be part of any military bloc. They don't trust the Russian Republic, and they don't like the fact that its leader Boris Yeltsin now has his finger on the nuclear button. While the fate of this superpower army is being debated, its troops are scaling down their activities, and they've been pulled out of trouble spots like Nagorno-Karabakh, where there's been fighting for almost 4 years between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. Since they left, though, violence has now flared up again there, with 11 people being killed and 30 wounded. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Over future military cooperation, despite a series of agreements drawn up by the Commonwealth of former Soviet republics. Boris Yeltsin wants the 11 members of the new Commonwealth to share joint military control. But Ukraine and 2 other states, Moldavia and Azerbaijan, are demanding the right to maintain their own armed forces. Azerbaijani troops have been shelling the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh after Boris Yeltsin ordered the Soviet army to pull out. Up to 14 people were killed.
The future of the former Soviet Union's armed forces is still shrouded in doubt. The Ukrainians are insisting they want their own army. Along with Moldavia and Azerbaijan, they're refusing even to take part in a combined armed forces for the new Commonwealth. At this base, the hammer and sickle has long since gone. It's the Ukrainian national flag that flies here. These men, who used to be Soviet soldiers, now swear allegiance to the Ukraine alone. The Ukrainians say they're still committed to getting rid of nuclear weapons from their territory, but they don't want to be part of any military bloc. They don't trust the Russian Republic, and they don't like the fact that its leader Boris Yeltsin now has his finger on the nuclear button. But some officers in Moscow are trying hard to stop the disintegration of what was the Soviet army.
It is very complicated, and sometimes I think it could be a little bit dangerous process if the leaders of independent states will not demonstrate their political wisdom.
While the fate of this superpower army is being debated, its troops are scaling down their activities, and they've been pulled out of trouble spots like Nagorno-Karabakh, where there's been fighting for almost 4 years between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. Since the troops left, violence has now flared up there again. More people have died today in the capital Stepanakert, where they've been trying to hold elections. As the soldiers withdraw, this is a test for the new Commonwealth. Can it keep the peace in such places as Nagorno-Karabakh better than the old Soviet Union? Or will regions like this descend, as Mikhail Gorbachev has warned, into even bloodier chaos? Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
The American Defense Secretary Dick Cheney has said the former Soviet authorities are still building nuclear weapons and targeting them at the United States. Mr. Cheney said ways had to be found to redirect Soviet military activity to civilian uses. He said until then, Americans wouldn't be confident that the former Soviet Union had really changed.
After the nuclear accident at Chernobyl, environmentalists are now a vocal political lobby in the Soviet Union. Today, Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, will declare itself the country's first nuclear-free city. Kiev intends to control the movement of nuclear waste in an area which is still affected by high levels of radiation as a result of Chernobyl. BBC News has had access to a nuclear site in the region previously unvisited by Western journalists. Our environment correspondent Ian Breach reports.
Until recently, few people in Kiev knew there was a nuclear waste dump in their city. It was a closely guarded secret that radioactive leftovers from reactors and research institutions in the 4 regions of Ukraine were brought here to be buried in vaults 40 meters deep in a compound set in the woods on the outskirts of the capital. Last week, that waste was still being delivered to the dump. The trucks that carried it were being primitively decontaminated, and nuclear waste was being transported freely through the city centre. But all this is to stop. The Chernobyl nuclear power station accident 5 years ago, acknowledged to have been an environmental health disaster, has changed attitudes. The city of Kiev will be a nuclear-free zone not only in a military sense. Everything to do with radiation will be on a short reign.
These are not official statistics, but 1 in 10 people in Kiev has some sort of nuclear-related disease. We'll never build reactors like the ones at Chernobyl again. Instead, we'll look for a safe alternative. Right now, Ukrainians, and in particular the people of Kiev, are opposed to anything to do with nuclear power.
100,000 signatures have been collected in the crusade to make Kiev the first nuclear-free city in the Republic and indeed in the whole of the Soviet Union. The people of the region already have a higher mortality rate than that prevailing in other Soviet states. They'll now inherit the legacy of sickness and death that will surely follow in the wake of Chernobyl. These campaigners see radiation as the greatest ecological threat.
Agricultural produce such as meat, milk and bread still comes from the contaminated areas and goes to the Ukraine and the rest of the USSR. We think this is dangerous and criminal.
There's just as much anxiety about the environmental impact of treating non-nuclear wastes. This incinerator takes half of the garbage collected from Kiev. It's inefficient and it's dangerously close to the city, to which it returns waste in the effluents it produces from burning the rubbish. Deadly dioxins carried on the wind and heavy metals washed into the watercourses. As the social upheaval here continues, it's hardly surprising that ecological concerns don't figure prominently on the political agenda. But there is grave and growing concern about the damage that's being done to the environment. The air is being polluted, the water is being contaminated. The river Dnieper, which is essential to the health and well-being of the people of Kiev, is being steadily poisoned by industrial contaminants. As Ukraine gains its independence, and the capital city its non-nuclear status, the people here will have to come to terms with a problem that besets the whole world: how to strike the balance between protecting the environment and developing the economy. Ian Breach, BBC News, Kiev.
20 to 9, some more business news now. Here's Paul.